Welcome to the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. My name is Aaron Harries. Wheats on Your Mind is brought to you by the Kansas Wheat Commission and Kansas Association of Wheat Growers. On this episode of the podcast, our guest is Corey Rosenbusch with the Fertilizer Institute. Corey Rosenbusch serves as the Fertilizer Institute's president and CEO, where he is responsible for leading efforts to advance the fertilizer industry. Before joining TFI, he served as president and CEO for the Global Cold Chain Alliance. He also lived in Indonesia, implementing a United States Department of Agriculture-funded agriculture development project for the Borlaug Institute. He also served as the National FFA president, representing the organization at state conventions and agriculture industry events. He holds degrees from Harvard and Texas A&M. Corey, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. With a Kansan, I served as an FFA officer, actually. So
who was that?
Brad Montgomery from Atwood, Kansas,
Great.
Way out west.
Yes, sir.
McDonald, Kansas, I guess technically is where he was from.
Yep.
He would drag me to Manhattan quite a bit. It was a fun little town to go to school in.
Well, I'm guessing you guys had a lot of great trips when you were officers. So let's talk about TFI. Just tell us briefly what TFI is.
Yeah, we're the Fertilizer Institute, and we represent the entire fertilizer supply chain here in Washington, D.C. So we have manufacturers, importers, distributors, and retailers of fertilizer. Advocacy is our primary focus, but obviously we do a lot of other typical association things such as meetings, events, training, etc.
And Corey spoke to us at U.S. Wheat and NOG meetings in Austin a few months back, and I was fascinated by the presentation, Corey. And you talked about fertilizer as a globally traded commodity, which I think a lot of us don't think in that sense. But it is truly global, and if you look at the map, it's amazing how fertilizer flows around the world.
It is. I think a lot of people believe that because the United States is such a leader in agricultural production, we must also be the leader when it comes to all inputs. And when it comes to fertilizer, that isn't always the case. And so we're only 10% actually of total global fertilizer consumption. India and China are well ahead of us. Brazil's ahead of us as well, but China is the largest consumer. India is the second largest consumer. We can get into all of the production numbers, but when it comes to something like potash, we don't produce a lot of potash here. We have to import over 95% of it.
Is there such a thing as fertilizer independence? Any countries around the world that are independent on fertilizer, or does everybody play the import-export game?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I've never really done the numbers on it, but I'll just hypothetically think about it for a second, in that obviously Russia is not a large agriculture producer. They produce a lot of wheat, of course, but they're the largest exporter of fertilizer because they don't need to use it all. So I would suspect they're somewhat independent just because they have all three major commodities. Same with China. China's got 40% of the world's phosphates. They're about a third of all nitrogen. They probably are bringing in quite a bit of potash, though. So it just kind of depends on where you are, and because those are rare earth materials, where God put them on this planet.
Yeah, and then because they're all over the world and sourced from all over the world, there are a lot of geopolitical challenges. And so let's just start with the one that is on everybody's mind, like the Russia-Ukraine conflict. When something like that happens, I suppose it has a ripple effects through the fertilizer economy.
In so many ways. I think initially we saw most major countries put a sanction all Russian fertilizer. So Europe, Canada, the United States did not. If you'll remember back in 2021, we were seeing quite a significant spike in fertilizer prices. And so I think the last thing the administration wanted to do was add that extra pressure. And so we still would allow Russian fertilizer to come in. I think the more interesting story, though, from the Russian conflict in Ukraine was natural gas. So natural gas is the core feedstock that's reacted with nitrogen in order to make ammonia and fertilizer. And most of Europe's natural gas comes from Russia. And so when they stopped bringing in that natural gas, Europe basically had to shutter their ammonia plants. 70% of their nitrogen production shut down because of a lack of natural gas that they were able to get from Russia. So it was weird. The trade flows just became so bizarre because we were importing UAN from Russia because we were one of the few countries that still could, and then yet the United States was exporting UAN to Europe because that was just what the trade flows were dictating at the time. None of that makes it cheaper and cost efficient for growers anywhere in the world. And then Russia, of course, became very focused on getting that fertilizer market access back. It was the subject of a meeting in Saudi Arabia with the Secretary of State Rubio and chief negotiators. And of the 5 things that Russia wanted for a peace agreement, fertilizer was on that list.
Yeah.
And so it became the target then. Ukraine started to bomb Russian ammonia plants. I think they took out 7 of them, or at least hit 7 of them at one point in time, under the guise that they were using it to make ammonium nitrate, which of course is an explosive that could be used in bomb making. So
yeah,
the connections are really bizarre when you think about them sometimes.
We don't have a visual, but one of your slides kind of showed the flow of fertilizer around the globe, the different sources and who's importing and exporting. I think a lot of people might come to the conclusion that you mentioned importing UAN from Russia, but we don't really lean too heavily on China and Russia for our fertilizer imports, do we, here in the United States?
China, no. As a matter of fact, if you want to think about, and we can jump to policy later, but right now there's just so much finger pointing going on, and look, the growers are having a challenging time right now. Access to markets, low commodity prices. I get it. The last thing they want to see is fertilizer prices go up. But I can tell you someone in Beijing is sitting back and giggling and watching us destroy ourselves and cannibalize each other because they know that they can control fertilizer production. They can then control food security and thus control national security. And, I don't have any proof that a lot of the pieces that we see in our social media feeds are being fed by them. But when it does come to China, they actually stopped exporting most of their fertilizer back in 2021.
Wow.
And I think a lot of it was done intentionally. I think they understood the war. I think they understood what was going on. I think they saw what was going on in the market. Now, a lot of that, from a phosphate perspective, 40% of the world's phosphate is produced in China, almost half. And they're no longer in the global marketplace. That is going to significantly shift prices that growers here in the United States pay. Now, they claim that most of that was to support their own food production because they want to be self-sufficient as a country. But a lot of that story was related to batteries. So 80% plus of batteries for electric vehicles are produced there in China, and lithium phosphate batteries use phosphate. And so they really wanted to focus a lot of that phosphate production on batteries as well.
Yeah, it's amazing to connect the dots and see how these things are related. Let's jump into U.S. numbers. Give us a few numbers. So, how much fertilizer production is domestic in the United States, and maybe break it down by the categories of the major macronutrients?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can start with nitrogen. Year to year it varies, but we're pretty self-sufficient in nitrogen production. We can import anywhere. It just really depends on the year and what the markets are doing. But, we still import 15 to 20% of our nitrogen total. It varies on product. So, for example, urea is a product we import a lot of. Russia is actually our largest supplier of urea and UAN. And natural gas allows us to do that. We have abundant and affordable natural gas in this country, so therefore, we're able to produce a lot here domestically. But you don't turn. I think a misconception that people have is that it's an assembly line that you can speed up, and you can't do that. It's one of those things where when you turn the plant on, it's going to run at 100%, and when spring planting's not here, because we use fertilizer domestically at very specific windows throughout the year, you've got to have a place to go with it. And so that's what facilitates a lot of that trade flow. And then if you think of the South, of course, they have a different planting season. So it's not as easy as just saying, we can produce all the nitrogen that we want here, because you can't just build these massive complexes and store it for a long period of time. If we go to potash, of course, I mentioned over 95% we have to import. We do have some potash production here in the United States. We have some new potash production coming online. It's not going to replace, 95% of our imports. Canada is, of course, where most of that comes from, about 85% of that. And from a cost perspective, that makes a lot of sense because it's more cost efficient to bring it in. Russia is where the other potash comes from, a little bit from the Middle East. And Belarus, who was sanctioned when they hijacked the Ryan airplane, has now come back into the marketplace, or will come back into the marketplace, because in November we negotiated the release of those political prisoners in exchange for lifting the sanction on potash.
Okay.
And so you wake up on a Saturday morning and you hear that in the news and you're like, what has happened? But potash is, that government, the Belarusian government, number one source of revenue. So that's back in play now. And then last but not least, phosphate, of course. We produce about 60% of our phosphate here. We've been under a lot of pressure about concentration in this industry. And I think this is one of the biggest misconceptions that people have, is that you can't just look at U.S. producers and say that's the market, because that U.S. production is only 60%. You have to add in all of the imported product as well to calculate that market share, because 40% of our use comes from outside the United States, right now led by Saudi Arabia.
Just out of curiosity, where is the new potash production coming online in the U.S.?
Yeah, so Michigan potash is
Really?
one facility. We've got some new entrants coming into the market in Utah. And then in the news, I guess a few weeks ago, Mosaic sold one of their New Mexican potash mines to a new player, International Materials, that's going to be producing there in New Mexico as well.
Let's dive into nitrogen a little bit. Obviously, that's the top of everybody's mind. I was pretty surprised to see that Trinidad and Tobago is a large exporter of anhydrous, I believe, to the United States. Why is that?
Second to Russia, Trinidad is our second largest importer. And it's largely because they have natural gas reserves there.
Okay.
And so just off the coast of Venezuela, we, of course, have heard all about Venezuela in the news. We know what their oil and gas capacity is. And so Trinidad pulls from some of those same reserves. And so that's why, as a matter of fact, 4 U.S. companies all have ammonia plants there. And so it's actually U.S. producers that are partnered up there in Trinidad to manufacture ammonia, urea, UAN, and then export it. Coincidentally, November 14th, when the president signed the executive order to exempt most fertilizers from the IEEPA tariffs, ammonia was the exception. Ammonia was not included in that. And as we started to kind of dig in, because most of that just comes from Russia and Trinidad, and Russia was already coming in at 0% because they were not subject to IEEPA tariffs, it really was just a Trinidad fact. And so Trinidad was the only country then that kind of was subject to that ammonia IEEPA tariff.
So does your organization, when something like that happens, is it your position to lobby against that specific tariff?
No, and it's tricky. We believe that trade should be open and fair and transparent and predictable. And that's our official policy position. And we lobby for that. We have to be careful not to get into the business of picking winners and losers. And so, as you can imagine, companies sit around our board table, and one decision by the president can be really good for one company and really bad for another company. And so when that happens, we just stay out of it. Now, we are very active in providing facts. And I think in some ways that helps make us an effective partner with policymakers, because we're not going to take one side or the other that affects a member. We're just going to present the data and then let those policymakers make those decisions. When it came to the IEEPA tariffs, that was a real challenging issue for us, because a lot of U.S. manufacturers were very supportive of the president's intention to build domestic capacity. And they compete oftentimes with foreign governments. So many of these foreign fertilizer manufacturers are state-controlled enterprises, and so it makes it difficult for them to compete on a global market. And these are $4 billion assets to build a new nitrogen plant. And so they really liked what President Trump was doing. They agreed with that. And so they felt that if they had to pay a 6% tariff, so fertilizer that goes into Europe is taxed at is tariffed at 6%, then Europe shouldn't be allowed to come to the United States at zero. It should be fair. And so that was just one example of how difficult that can get. And of course, I have European members around the board table that are like,
right.
"Oh, you're taking our market away now." So it's really hard.
Yeah, we should have said at the outset, TFI is not a U.S. organization. I mean, you have members from all over the world.
Yeah, we technically say we represent the U.S. fertilizer industry, but companies from all over the world are involved in the U.S. fertilizer industry. I mean, Saudi Arabia is a great example. I mentioned they were our largest phosphate producer. Well, they had not sent a vessel of phosphate here since April 1. Matter of fact, I still don't know that a vessel has landed. And just the tariffs made it too unpredictable for them to access this market. So they have a very specific agenda that they want to achieve as a company. So we have to be careful, as you can imagine. So we try to just be honest brokers and present data and information and let policymakers decide when it comes to the tariff issues.
I believe when you spoke to us in Austin, you told us a story about Marco Rubio and Saudi Arabia. There's a little bit of political chess behind the scenes there.
Yeah, so the two stories. So Saudi Arabia, Putin actually flew to Saudi Arabia and met with the Crown Prince early last year. It might even been end of 2024. And part of the conversation the world thought really was centering around an oil conversation, oil cartel, so to speak. It was really a fertilizer conversation. And I think Russia knew that if Saudi and Russia were to team up and form some sort of a global fertilizer cartel, they could truly control global supply as two of the world's largest producers. And I think that brought a lot of attention to how important fertilizer is and how it was being weaponized on a geopolitical stage. So when Rubio flew to Saudi and they negotiated this, they were involved in negotiating some sort of a peace treaty with Ukraine and Russia. Of those 5 things that Russia asked for, fertilizer market access was one of them. Now, they were already accessing the U.S. market, so that wasn't necessarily the challenge, but the rest of the world, they were still, somewhat limited. And of course, with banks and the financial payment system, it made it very difficult for them to access those markets.
Wow. Jumping back to what you mentioned earlier, when we've had some of this price volatility, especially in nitrogen, there was that push for increasing domestic production. What have we seen as a result of that?
Yeah, I think you might be referring to the Biden administration's fertilizer program that they launched.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I think in concept, they understood the importance of investing in domestic production, that would be one solution to limiting some of our exposure to global markets and especially geopolitical issues. I believe at the time they put $500 million into that when it costs $4 billion to build a new nitrogen plant. It doesn't really factor into true bolstering domestic production. So, yeah, we've seen some new nitrogen come online, mainly for the low carbon market. But other than that, there's some new technology, which is important, that we're funded by some of those to make fertilizer more efficient.
The subject of price volatility, a lot of discussion at recent meetings in D.C. about, we've got market concerns for U.S. wheat, but really the input costs are what's on the minds of farmers. So what's your message maybe to Kansas wheat farmers on fertilizer price volatility? I mean, we've talked about it in this whole conversation, but what can you give them for advice and the message going forward?
Man, I don't know that I have advice for them. I'm sorry. It's not a good time. It's really difficult when growers are experiencing low commodity prices and their input costs are going the other way. And I think historically what most growers have experienced is that when commodity prices are strong and you have increased acreage that then drives additional demand, then prices follow that traditional supply-demand economics. This is a completely different scenario where that's not what's happening, and it's really because of, one, we've got supply constraints mainly due to geopolitics, but other reasons as well. I mentioned China, that being out of the market, that really impacts global supply. And then from a demand standpoint, we had, so half of all fertilizer applied in the United States is actually applied to corn. So when you look at use in the United States, that's the key driver. Wheat is about 10% of total demand. And despite commodity prices being low, we saw an increase in corn acres last year.
Yeah.
A significant increase. And that, of course, drove up demand when there wasn't supply. And so therefore, that had a big impact. I think I would watch what some of those, my advice would be watch what some of those global players are doing. Watch and see how, vessels may start to come back to the United States now that some of the EPA tariffs have been lifted. And then I think my last comment would just be there's no better time to be a good steward of your fertilizer. When we saw this condition happen in 21, 22, we really got the 4 R's of nutrient stewardship out there to make sure everyone was using variable rate applications. They were ensuring the right source, rate, time, place was being followed. Look at some of the new technologies that are out there that make your fertilizer, stretch further because it's more efficient, whether that be a slow release technology or a microbial biostimulant that helps the microbes better utilize that fertilizer in the ground. So now's the time to really tighten the belt and look at some of those good stewardship things, because you can't control, as a grower in Kansas, what China's going to do, what Russia's going to do. The supply spigot is not something that they can necessarily put their hands on.
Yeah, and the one thing we really haven't talked about on the demand side, I think 90% of fertilizer consumption occurs out of the United States, but there's emerging fertilizer use markets, right? As we have some developing nations who are improving their cropping systems, they're starting to suck that fertilizer up too, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's a great point. So from a consumption standpoint, you've got some interesting dynamics going out there. I'll start with India. And of course, India is the second largest producer. So if we take China off the table, which is the largest, and assume that that's where a lot of their domestic production is going, India is the opposite. They have to import almost all of their fertilizer. And as the world's largest importer of fertilizer, they do it as a central government. And so they will completely subsidize their purchases and then give it to the farmers for sustenance farming. And that's what you can also watch, is because India will go and tender 1.5 million tons of urea at a certain price, and that sets the global market.
Yeah, wow.
Right? When you're that big of a buyer, you can basically look at it and say, okay, that's going to take up, someone told me 60,000 trucks, 60,000 truckloads is kind of a good comparison of what that is. Uh-huh. And so there you go. There's your global price that gets set. And then some of the commodities that are experiencing a big bump right now and thus demanding more fertilizer are, sunflower, coffee, rubber, palm oil. Those are not grown in the United States. So we don't really have visibility to the fact that there are commodity prices out there that are popping and have additional demand for fertilizer.
Well, putting my wheat hat on, we know that our wheat farmers aren't just wheat farmers, and they have corn and other crops in the rotation. So the fertilizer picture is looked at as the whole cropping system. So I do encourage listeners to go check out the TFI website. A wealth of great information there available on the global fertilizer picture, which is three-dimensional chess. I'm learning that as we speak. So any other programs or research that TFI is working on?
Yeah, Aaron, thanks for asking that, because we are getting ready to launch a farmer-facing website, okay. a source that farmers can go to learn about all of this, and we're going to update it regularly. And when, Belarus released prisoners, why that matters to their fertilizer price, and just things that probably aren't on their radar at all. One of the things that we have been asking the administration and Congress for is to invest in a fertilizer economist at USDA.
Okay.
Because I think through all of this, there's so much misinformation out there. We hear a lot about U.S. concentration of manufacturing that isn't including all of the importers. So, I'll use phosphates as an example, and they'll they'll often say, well, there's only 4 phosphate producers for U.S. farmers. Well, there's 4 U.S. phosphate producers, but we actually apply phosphate from 12 different companies because we have all of the imports coming in as well. And that's part of that market share. But there's no real good source. It's hard for a grower to find information because it's just not transparent and available. And so that's why we would love to see USDA to step up their game. And maybe it's beyond a fertilizer economist and its entire input economist. So it's their chemicals, their seed, a little bit of everything that goes into it. But in the meantime, we will, and we can share that with your growers, that website, so that they can bookmark that and go back there regularly to see what updates are happening and where the market's going.
Well, Corey, this has been a great discussion. You never have a dull minute in your job, do you?
I wish I did. We had a string there in the fall where every Saturday morning we'd wake up to some news, some current event, something happening. Yeah, it does make it fun. And growing up as the son of an ag teacher and around agriculture and passionate about agriculture, I wish I had a magic wand to just fix these problems. But we're at least working every day to ensure from a policy perspective, we have the right policies in place to ensure the American farmer, does have an abundant supply of fertilizer to be the best producer in the world.
Well, we know you're working hard. We appreciate that, and we'll share information on that new website when that becomes available. Corey, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Aaron.
My thanks to Corey Rosenbusch with the Fertilizer Institute for being my guest on this episode of the Wheats on Your Mind podcast. If you have any questions as a follow-up or any ideas for a future episode, please email us at kswheat@kswheat.com. You can find all previous episodes at wheatsonyourmind.com. Thanks for listening.